and so we shall start with the introduction of our speaker. Dr. Stefanis, would you like to say 2 words? And then I will say 2 words, and then Fran, the floor will be yours. Κύριε Στεφανή.
Σιγά σιγά ας αρχίσουμε λοιπόν. Σας καλωσορίζω όλους στο απόψινό μας σεμινάριο. Thank you very much for Professor Titchener for the participation in our seminar in the Academy of Athens. We feel that you are here with us. Και όλους τους υπολείπους φίλους και εκλεκτούς συνοδοιπόρους στο σεμινάριο μας φέτος, παρόλες τις δυσκολίες, που ελπίζουμε θα καμφθούν γρήγορα και θα σας έχουμε στην ανατολική αίθουσα πλέον της Ακαδημίας Αθηνών από του χρόνου, με το καλό, από τον Οκτώβριο. Συνεχίζεται λοιπόν με την ομιλία της καθηγήτριας Τίτchener το σεμινάριό μας, που για φέτος έχει τίτλο, έχει θεματική «Ένος και ψόγος στην αρχαία λογοτεχνία». Ευχαριστώ θερμά την Έφη την Παπαδόδημα, την ερευνήτρια του κέντρου μας, για την άψογη διοργάνωση του σεμιναρίου, παρά τις τεχνικές δυσκολίες καμιά φορά. Και την προηγούμενη φορά, παρόλες τις δυσκολίες, τα πράγματα πήγαν θαυμάσια, μπορείτε να το παρακολουθείτε. Είναι πλέον κτήμα σας και, αυτή η διάλεξη που είχε κάποιες ατυχίες, αλλά ελπίζω να προχωρήσουμε έτσι καλά. Σας ευχαριστώ λοιπόν όλους που είστε απόψε μαζί μας. Έφη.
Thank you, Dr. Stefanis. Just a very few words. I do want to welcome you all once again, and of course our speaker, Professor Titchener. Personally, I have been waiting, I have been looking forward to meeting her in Athens, but I'm sure we will make it, happen next year, if not later. Just on the typical part, Francis Titchener is Distinguished Professor of History and Classics at Utah State University, and if I might say so, a very valuable companion in this year's seminar on praise and blame. I do thank her for her participation so far from my heart. Now, among many other academic activities and distinctions, she has been awarded a Fulbright Research Grant to Belgium. And later on, she was a visiting professor at Belgium, Leuven, and at the University of Crete in our beloved Rethymnon. Professor Titchener, above all, is a leading expert on Plutarch, as we all know, on whom she has published very extensively. Many books, many graded volumes, many articles. She's also the editor of Plutarch, the Journal of International Plutarch Society, and also the co-editor, among other things, of the forthcoming, if I'm not mistaken, it's not yet out, Cambridge Companion to Plutarch. Okay, sorry if it's out, I think it is not. So it is only natural and very fortunate, of course, that today we can all benefit from her expertise on Plutarch. And I actually do think that her talk today will tie in very well with Professor Duff's talk on praise and blame in Plutarch about 2 weeks ago in this same seminar. So today, Professor Titchener is going to speak about self-praise and self-presentation in Plutarch. And Fran, if you allow me, σε καλωσορίζω.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. And Daxi. I have been thinking a lot about self-presentation these days as we do so many things in Zoom, so many things completely different. So I chose a background to reflect my appreciation of the invitation from the Academy of Athens, somewhere I have never been, but I'm absolutely confident that I will have a choice. I thought about putting up some of my other backgrounds. I terrorize my students with things like a giant peacock feather where I am Juno, or perhaps buffalo at Yellowstone to show my mood. But having honored you, I will now go to my typical blurred background. I am reading text or using a script today, but I'm going to try very hard not to just read. As I said, I'm out of practice, and I am using the script as a crutch in case of total brain blank out, tech failure, or something like that. So if I sound a little stilted, that's why. I'm also speaking a little more slowly than usual and trying to be careful of my consonants. My goal today is talking about self-praise in Plutarch's self-presentation. And how I intend to do this is talk a little bit about Plutarch himself, self-praise in general among the ancients, Plutarch himself on self-praise, the reception of Plutarch's comments on self-praise, and then I have a series of passages that I would like to go through with you, and the more that's a group activity, the better, where we look at how well Plutarch does in terms of taking his own advice on self-praise in his self-presentation. As I said, self-presentation these days has taken on this new meaning where we can curate our own presentation of ourselves to a whole new level, since we can control how much of us is seen or how. I want immediately here to thank Effie for inviting me to participate in this wonderful seminar. And I praise her publicly and strongly for keeping it going so well in these astonishingly trying times. In my wildest dreams, I would not ever have guessed when I accepted this invitation that I would not actually be in Athens, nor the reason for this, nor that people would figure out a way to carry on so brilliantly. So I offer my thanks, congratulations, and hope that I can make a meaningful contribution. You'll see that Effie is sharing my handout. This is also available to you on your own, and this is mostly the passages we'll be going through later. So in general, Plutarch presents himself in his own works as a trusted figure who garnered authority with deliberate and careful self-presentation, with a healthy dose of self-praise to deliver his message. Desse ipsum citra in William laudando, afterwards Desse et laudando, is the work that most Plutarchian scholars consult for Plutarch's view on self-presentation in the form of autologia, or self-praise. In that essay, Plutarch gives us multiple situations when it is appropriate to praise oneself, and various techniques to avoid incurring ill will while doing so, since self-praise is a tricky thing. As we examine the series of passages, I hope to show, by discussing Plutarch's use of periautologia, that Plutarch is a master of self-presentation, and that this is part of his appeal. I need to make a disclaimer. Before I go further, I need to acknowledge the source of my inquiry, which comes from an essay, hopefully forthcoming, in an honorary volume for John Marincola, in which the contributions focus heavily on Marincola's influential work of 97, Authority and Tradition in Ancient Historiography. In that book, Marincola examined various ways in which historians used tradition to claim and bolster their own authority, identifying 5 specific techniques: reference to gods and fortune, pretense of necessity, commonness of action, praise in the mouth of others, which is where I'm jumping off, and magnification of actions. I have grease on the brain. My contribution to that volume investigates Plutarch's use of those techniques and is tied very specifically to Marincola's work. Although this paper builds on that work, it is different in its scope and focus. And here I thank and acknowledge the editors of The Authoritative Historian for graciously permitting me to carry on with this interesting topic. As I hope will soon be clear, I have had the pleasure of hearing several of my colleagues speak in this series and have benefited considerably from this. One thing I realize is that we Plutarch scholars tend to get very specific very quickly. And I think a little background is in order at the risk of being too basic. So hardcore Plutarchans, this is your time to refill coffee. Here is some of what we know or believe we know about Plutarch from his own writings. He seems to have been a kind man, devoted to his family and friends, many of whom make appearances in the Moralia essays. He was active in public life, political and religious. He lived his long and productive life in Ionia, northwest of Athens, where he served as a priest of Delphi and in various capacities in connection with the Roman Empire. He tells us that he was a young man studying mathematics at the academy when Nero visited Greece sometime around 67 Common Era, meaning Plutarch must have been born somewhere around 46 Common Era. In the dialogue, the E at Delphi, Plutarch describes one Eustrophus making an argument from the position of the letter epsilon as fifth in the alphabet and its significance in counting by fives, pempadzine. Plutarch tells us, quote, in the E at Delphi, these words Eustrophus addressed to us not in jest, but for the reason that at this time, I, Plutarch, was devoting myself to mathematics with the greatest enthusiasm, although I was destined soon to pay all honor to the maxim, avoid extremes, when I had once become a member of the academy. This is a vivid picture from an older scholar looking back on his youthful enthusiasm. And this self-deprecation has been shown earlier, partly by Harrison with Horace, as typical of self-presentation that avoids giving offense. To me, very similar to young Pliny, continuing with his homework as Vesuvius erupted outside. And Pliny says, I don't know whether I should call this courage or folly on my part. I was only 17 at the time. But I called for a volume of Livy and went on reading as if I had nothing else to do. I even went on with the extracts I had been making. And I find this absolutely vivid illustration of young students and their belief in the significance of what they're doing. They must carry on even during erupting Vesuvius. I've told my own students, if Vesuvius erupts, put your Livy down and run for it. Despite the smallness of Plutarch's hometown, Chaeronea, it was hardly isolated, situated as it was in such a way that it was easily accessible via the Corinthian Gulf to Italy, Macedonia, even the Black Sea, as well as Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. So friends and travelers from all those places would find it easy to visit him. He tells us ultimately that he stayed there so that it would not become even smaller. Now, here's my point. These biographical details come from explicit statements by Plutarch himself or inferred statements from his work, particularly the Quaestiones Convivales or table talks, which are dialogues of conversations featuring Plutarch and his friends and relatives. I refer to Tim Whitmarsh's earlier emphasis in his presentation on Alexandria on separating the narrator from the author, so important. Plutarch is a character in his dialogues, is a narrator. He is not necessarily Plutarch himself. I have argued elsewhere that it does not matter whether these dinner parties actually took place or whether or not the transcripts of these conversations were verbatim. But the biographical details are an exception since we want to rely on them. And there has been much scholarship on these details over the years, among which, in my opinion, still the most useful is Pirch on prosopography des Amis de Plutarch in your bibliography. This is now 20 years old at 1992, but it is still the most, in my opinion, thorough, useful, and easy to use collection of the people Plutarch talks about in his works, both his relatives and his friends. For our purposes, I accept the details I just gave you as basically accurate. All right, I want to turn now to the ancients in general on self-praise. And again, I'm sorry about this with the handout, Effie. I haven't even got there yet. This is my Sega. I'm just winding up. In the Roman literary tradition, self-praise brings to mind almost immediately the stock character of the Braggart Soldier, brilliantly illustrated by Richard Lester's 1966 movie, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. In that movie, which is a collection of Plautine plots, I think you have Haunted House, you have Menechmi, as well as the Miles. In this movie, the Miles warns everyone to stand aside as he dismounts his horse because, quote, I take large steps. Plautus's Miles brags, punched an elephant right through the leg because he is insecure. His self-praise reveals weakness. Theophrastus's braggart character is not surprisingly very similar. We are told that boastfulness, alazanea, seems to be the pretense, prospoesis, to good things that don't actually exist, agathon uk onton. In this sketch, for instance, we hear that the braggart loves also to impose upon his companion by the road with a story of how he served with Alexander and on what terms he was with him and what a number of gemmed cups he brought home, contending too that the Asiatic artists are superior to those of Europe. And all this when he has never been out of Attica. But for the more philosophically oriented authors, self-praise can show great self-confidence as the speaker presents himself as a worthy guide or instructor in the Plutarchian mode. Roy Gibson addresses this phenomenon in Pliny. You have the reference on your handout, beginning, I think, hilariously by saying, if there is an art of praising the self inoffensively, then Pliny may be felt not to have mastered it. Gibson goes on to give various examples of Pliny's lack of modesty, such as, quote, Pliny's account of the worshipful silence which greeted him on his return to the lecture hall, or his retelling of the stories which the overgenerous Artemidorus had been spreading of Pliny's many services to the former at a time of great peril under Domitian. Gibson notes that Pliny acknowledged that there was a dividing line beyond which praise annoyed those hearing it, saying in one of his letters about the publication of one of Pliny's own speeches, quote, it makes me seem rather carried away by my own praises. This puts me in a very difficult and delicate position. So far, so good. But then Pliny adds, though somewhat justified by this praise being inevitable, there is that confidence we mentioned, supporting effusive self-praise. Most interestingly to me, in light of recent presentation by Tim Whitmarsh, is Gibson citing Glenn Most for the idea that, quote, when characters in Homer and the Greek novel talk about themselves to strangers, there appears to be pressure to deliver tales of personal woe, most obviously in the autobiographical narrative given by Odysseus to Alcinous and Arete in Odyssey 9:12. Earlier in this seminar, some of you will remember, Tim Whitmarsh brought up this same passage, but from a different point of view, which is something I love about these seminars, is to hear things from different perspectives. You see things you hadn't thought of. What Tim was saying, in my understanding, and let us not make Professor Whitmarsh responsible for things I misunderstood, but I understood him to say, as he discussed the role of alexaneia, that this was lying self-praise. And Whitmarsh found it problematic since, as we're listening to Odysseus in these fantastical stories, I had a quote in my notes from Tim saying, "Do we want to be humbugged like the credulous Phaeacians?" Whitmarsh, emphasizing the importance of separating the author from the narrator, pointed to blurred identities where the author acted almost as an intermediary between the real and fictional world, telling readers that they had been warned. So as they continue to listen to this self-praise bordering on boastfulness, they have been warned that this may or may not be completely truthful. Gibson in the Pliny article elaborates later on this suggestion, saying, quote, "The crucial context here is that such tales are almost invariably told to strangers, such as Alcinous and Arete. Where Odysseus's autobiographical tales do end happily, they are then usually told only to people he knows and whose trustworthiness he has determined by testing. The cultural pressure exerted on the narrators in Homer and the Greek novel to reserve tales of successful exploits for the company of intimates coheres with the mitigation awarded by Quintilian to Cicero and by Cicero to himself for self-praise in the context of private letters to friends. In other words, when speaking with intimates, friends in a non-public setting, it's much more appropriate to say, I did great, I was great. It's less offensive. When speaking to people you don't know, it's better to lead with painful things that happen to you, less good. Now let's turn to Plutarch's own words on self-praise. And his essay on, here we go, thank you, Effie, that's just right, on inoffensive self-praise is a prime place for biographical detail mining because of its topic, if nothing else. The essays begin with an introduction to the nature of self-praise, followed by discussion of circumstances when self-praise might be appropriate and how to make it so. And finally, suggestions for avoiding unnecessary or inappropriate self-praise. The essay begins with a stern warning. Quote, says Plutarch, "For first, we regard self-praisers as shameless, since they should be embarrassed even by praise from others. Second, as unfair, as they arrogate to themselves what it is for others to bestow. And in the third place, if we listen in silence, we appear disgruntled and envious. While if we shy at this, we are forced to join in the eulogies and condemn them against our better judgment." So Plutarch is saying, you have to be careful with self-praise because you are hijacking people's own attitude, own opinion, dictating to them how they should feel. And this is bad for all kinds of reasons. But there are occasions when self-praise can be employed without resentment, and indeed, according to Plutarch, should be. There is defending oneself against slander. And Plutarch uses the example of Pericles at the opening of the funeral oration, where, as we recall, that's a pretty good smackdown of the Athenian public by Pericles in terms of basically, I am not surprised at your attitude under the circumstances. Plutarch gives us another example where it's good of Epaminondas, and this is in the life of Pelopidas. Our lack of Plutarch's life of Epaminondas paired with Scipio is one of the saddest things for Plutarchans, not to have Plutarch's biography of his hometown hero. And I myself would certainly also like to see the life of Scipio, but still, in Pelopidas, Plutarch has Epaminondas reminding the Thebans of his own achievements and how they could take a step back, thinking of what he had done for them. Plutarch also says we can divert some of this bad feeling by using contrast to show that things could have been worse. Lycurgus, attacked for paying an informer, remarked that it was a strong point of his character that he was accused of giving rather than taking money. And that also has little self-deprecation and humor, which always helps. Co-opting or hijacking, as I said before, disapprovers was another good use of self-praise, either by including the audience as part of the victory or by honoring an individual with similar traits. Plutarch says, quote, "This the statesman must in any case understand, and for this he must seize the proper occasions. Even then, a wise individual will share credit, ideally with divine intervention." Plutarch suggests that Sulla's adopting the nickname Felix is one way to do that, that at all times you're indicating your success had to do to a certain extent with luck. Plutarch tells us men would rather be bested by luck than by merit, feeling that in the first event, another has had an advantage. So if you're bested by luck, people had an unfair advantage. If you're bested by merit, the failure lies in ourselves. It's our own doing. We don't like that. It's also possible to transfer praise. If we decline big honors, small honors are not begrudged. Admitting to small faults is another way to divert bad feeling, as long as those faults are not shameful. And there should be a purpose to your self-praise, whether it is inspiring imitation, which is Plutarch's whole stock in trade, giving you examples to think about, to emulate, or even avoid. Or purpose of self-praise can be rallying comrades, as when Odysseus reminded his sailors, terrified of Charybdis, that Odysseus's own Arete and Boule had saved them from the Cyclops, and they should have confidence he would save them now. Plutarch closes by advising us how we may avoid the bad kind of self-praise. And as so often when reading Plutarch, I can't believe this is written 2,000 years ago, he observes that philotimia, or rivalry, tends to occur in us when we hear others praised. And I think that's very funny. There's also the danger in a narrative of events turning into unrestrained bragging in the presence of approval, something Plutarch says is a problem for courtiers and military officers. And he also warns us against the ever-present temptation to name drop, thereby inflating our own importance. And he particularly warns against getting carried away when others are praising you. In America, we call this believing your own reviews. The safest route, says Plutarch, is focus on self-praise by others and how distasteful it is to hear people talk like that. And he concludes the essay by telling us, avoid talking about ourselves like that unless we have some great advantage to the hearers or to ourselves. If there's something that makes it worth it in the way we just discussed, okay, but otherwise keep your greatness to yourself. Not surprisingly, this essay, De Se Laudando, has been one of the things in Plutarch's massive oeuvre consulted by all kinds of different scholars because of its importance to the rhetorical tradition. Not just Plutarchans read this thing. We Plutarchan scholars tend to consult that essay for an ethical take on a rhetorical topic, but so do others. And here I'll give you just two examples, one from biblical studies, one from political studies, and both of these bibliography entries are in your handout. The first is M. Mitchell in A Patristic Perspective on Pauline Periodologia. Mitchell acknowledges that similarities between Paul's boasting in 2 Corinthians 11:12 and Plutarch's essay have been noted, these similarities, at least since an important commentary in 1924. But Mitchell is going to show specifically that John Chrysostom, the rhetorically trained Antiochene, defends Paul's speech about himself on precisely the grounds Plutarch allowed for inoffensive boasting. And Mitchell shows this point by point, that Chrysostom can excuse Paul for the same reasons that Plutarch is saying we can excuse boasting. Chrysostom, like Plutarch, understands that boasting is seen by most people as offensive and unpleasant, and that there is danger in such talk. But again, remember the reason. Chrysostom says the reason is very important: salvation and edification of the listeners, and therefore it is appropriate to invoke any and all techniques, including one step beyond self-praise into flat-out bragging. Second, Nicolai in Julian, Plutarch, and the Dangers of Self-Praise suggests that Julian's political writings show the influence of a model of an unexpected nature, Plutarch's De Se Laudando. Here, the scholarly interest lies in Julian's use of Plutarch's Moralia, his essays. Plutarch's two big contributions are the Moralia, the essays, and of course the parallel lives, paired biographies usually of Greeks and Romans. Julian is very interested in the parallel lives. His own text evidently contains many textual essay echoes, but his interest in Moralia is not understood. Nicolai shows that Julian is using this essay as a model in his own writings, suggesting that Julian was particularly attracted to the fact that in De Se Laudando, the addressee or ideal reader is a statesman. And so Julian identifies this. It's an essay directed towards other statesmen. Making specific reference to what she calls Plutarch's cures, pharmaca, Nicolai convincingly shows that all of the Plutarchian pharmaca, the cures for offensive self-praise, recur many times, and that Julian, quote, systematically exploited Plutarch's whole set of rhetorical strategies with the aim of presenting himself in a better light without risking exposure to charges of arrogance and conceit. But for Plutarch scholars, the best place to start is with Donald Russell's self-disclosure in Plutarch and in Horace, also on your bibliography. Donald Russell, as always, providing great insight into Plutarch's way of thinking. And as many of us know, Donald Russell's generosity in sharing his own great expertise in education has benefited many of us. And it is very sad to me I was not able, now that he has passed, to talk about a passage where I actually disagree with him, something that almost never happens. I am assuming I am wrong in this disagreement, but Plutarch scholars, you will never go wrong, starting with Donald Russell. Naturally, self-disclosure in Plutarch and Horace was very exciting to me after Stephen Harrison's presentation, since I knew I was going to see some very useful comparisons. Russell draws attention to Plutarch and Horace's similar moral outlooks and their mutual propensity for illuminating those moral outlooks through self-disclosure in their works, which Harrison brilliantly showed, while observing that Plutarch does this differently in the essays than in the parallel lives. Russell says in the essays, this self-disclosure is generally intended to lend authority to a didactic point, whereas in the parallel lives, self-disclosure by Plutarch is generally intended simply to authorize a statement or claim special knowledge. Russell concludes, in brief, Plutarch dispenses facts about himself sparingly and for the purpose at hand. And that both in Plutarch and in Horace, self-disclosure is in general an aspect of the teaching function of literature. And I feel that Timothy Duff, in his nuanced presentation of Plutarch's direction of praise and blame to his biographical subjects, also very much emphasized the teaching function of literature, suggesting that Plutarch's narratorial intervention is subtle, but it can be converted, in Duff's words, to injunctions if necessary. We can start with an example, we can strengthen the example, and then we can actually deliver the admonition. Recently, as in last week, Stephen Harrison in his presentation gave us numerous examples of how Horace, while bragging at an almost Lucretian level, adds an ironic and self-deprecating tone that removes offense. Harrison's example of Horace as the king bee in Epode 1 comes to mind, where Horace is king all right, but as Harrison points out, the bee brings a humbling tone since bees are small. Their lives are short. They live as part of a community to which they contribute as members. And yet, and I wish I said something, bees can sting, and for some people fatally, which I think makes Harrison's point even better. As Plutarch says in De Sed Laudando, there is tact, however, and grace in one who tells of some slip of his own or some mistake or feeling of ambition or weakness for some piece of instruction or information. In other words, mistakes made in trying to acquire information, going too far, being inappropriate, can actually be useful. All right, now we turn to the actual Plutarchan passages. And what I'm hoping to do here, and I also realize I am running way long, so I'll try to make this short. What we want to look at is Plutarch showing us himself in some of these essays and talk about what he may or may not be wanting to say. Now let's start with the passage from Anseni Res Publica that should be 2 on your handout. Here, Plutarch invokes the authority of his own life as a priest of Delphi in order to make his point about the value of older statesmen. And I will insert here that reading Anseni gets more fun the older one gets oneself. First, you accept Plutarch's point, and the older you get, you're thinking he's absolutely right. And you think he is absolutely right. More people should listen to older people. Here's what he says. Now, surely you know, says Plutarch, that I have been serving the Pythian Apollo for many Pythiads, but you would not say, Plutarch, you have done enough sacrificing, marching in processions, and dancing in choruses. And now that you are older, it is time to put off the garland and to desert the oracle on account of your age. And so do not imagine, says Plutarch, that you yourself, being a leader and interpreter of the sacred rites of civic life, ought to give up the worship of Zeus and of the state and of the forum, rites to which you have for a long time been consecrated. Now, things that grab my attention, the very beginning, surely you know, hello, that is quite an invitation. Now, that may or may not be true, but still, I don't think these days that might necessarily be true, that we knew Plutarch was a priest of Pythian Apollo. You may know it because I told it to you at the beginning of our conversation. So I start with, surely you know I have been serving for many years. All right, we are seeing Plutarch in a very particular way. Nobody would say to me, Plutarch, you've done enough. Again, I love this vivid description of the ceremonies in process. Again, reminding me very much of the Endabaki when the old men realized they were going to have to dance and saddle up and ride, as we say. So here, Plutarch, marching in procession and dancing, which is harder for older people, but he's doing it anyway. He puts himself second, he puts his duty first. And so having established himself that way, he can really, as we say, finger wag. So don't you think? So we begin with saying, surely you know, as a priest of Delphi, and then we conclude with, so don't you tell me. We move past being impressed at Plutarch's vigor, dancing in choruses, marching in procession, and his dedication. We might feel envy about that. Maybe we ourselves are not particularly up to marching in the procession or dancing in the chorus. And so we think, we move past envy or negativity and we admire his piety, his concern for gods in religion, and we're filled with a desire to emulate. And Plutarch is all about that, particularly in the parallel lives. And he's very specific about it, that he gives us examples to think about. What would Pericles do? What would Nicias do? In which case, sometimes don't do that, but still. So in that particular passage, we have Plutarch presented very vividly, carrying out his duties as a Delphic priest. But his reason for this is to hammer on the idea that age can be an enhancer, not a disqualifier. Let's move on to the next passage, Praecepta 8:11b. And this example comes from Plutarch in discussing how to be a good citizen, how to be involved in public works. He is acting as a supervisor of brick and sewer work. And he tells us, no doubt, I myself seem ridiculous to visitors in our town when I am seen in public, as I often am, engaged in such matters. But I am helped by the remark of Antisthenes, which has been handed down to memory. For when someone expressed surprise that he himself carried a dried fish through the marketplace, he said, yes, but it's for myself. I, on the other hand, say to those who criticize me for standing and watching tiles being measured, or concrete or stones being delivered, that I attend to these things not for myself, but for my native place. Now, I see several things going on here. First of all, I have a very vivid picture of Plutarch supervising unloading of bricks and such, or just plain watching. As we all know, public works can be fascinating, especially if they've cleared things out you don't normally get to see. In the US, construction sites that are fenced in for safety often have viewing windows or peepholes where people can watch what's going on inside. It's really interesting. However, I point out that those are peepholes to the inside. We are not meant to be in there getting in the way. And I laugh a little bit about Plutarch supervising, who I think sometimes was causing a little more work for the people trying to haul these bricks, as he decided it was time to measure one or perhaps move one. So this is what do we say? Not an unintentional self-disclosure, but a nuanced self-disclosure that we can take several ways. There's also the idea that he says, I myself seem ridiculous doing this. Well, okay. I think that he means, as a distinguished, important person to the untrained eye, he's standing around getting in the way of the people unloading the bricks. But he wishes to make it clear that he is carrying out a very important public spirited purpose. And as I said, I see this as a considerably bigger picture. But what is Plutarch telling us? He is a public servant. He does not put his own prestige above what he thinks needs to be done. Just the way he marches and dances in the ceremony, even if he's got old aching knees, he's going to do what needs to be done, even if he thinks he looks ridiculous and people are going to make fun of him. This modesty or self-deprecation is really common in Plutarch, and as we saw last week, also in Horace. And it is one of his favorite techniques for mitigating self-praise. Sometimes this is conventional, recusatio style downplaying of his talent, like in the opening of Nicias, where Plutarch entreats his audience not to think that he intended to compete with the incomparable Thucydides, but that it was necessary to refer to the great historian in order to avoid accusations of carelessness. So that's your recusatio. Here in this passage, Plutarch begins by self-deprecating, but is really claiming credit for being an active, involved citizen, giving of his own personal time, and risking ridicule in order to do what he believes is right. He uses praise, in Miracola's words, in the mouth of another to claim some credit without seeming boastful. This is what's known in modern parlance as the humble brag. I'll talk more about that in a minute. I added the next reference of Fabius Maximus, which does not feature Plutarch's disclosure of himself, but I think the attitude is worth going through really quickly. In Fabius 5.3, Plutarch's biography, we learn that the great future dictator was not universally appreciated while he was avoiding Hannibal during the great delaying. Plutarch says, for merely consuming time in this way, Fabius was generally despised by his countrymen and roundly abused, even in his own camp. Much more did his enemies think him a man of no courage and a mere nobody, all except Hannibal. He and he alone comprehended the cleverness of his antagonist and the style of warfare which he had adopted. Now, in that passage, Plutarch seems to be diminishing Fabius by showing Romans and Carthaginian hostility and contempt for Fabian tactics. But in fact, praise in the mouth of another, Plutarch redeems Fabius by praise from the great Hannibal, which kind of cancels out these other people. And so I have thrown that in there to help with Plutarch's attitude. Moving on to Praecepta 8:16. Here is Plutarch on the road. This is a very famous passage. All Plutarchian scholars out there familiar with it because it is such an example of Plutarch's presentation of himself. Plutarch says, I recollect that when I was still a young man, I was sent with another as envoy to the proconsul. The other man was somehow left behind. I alone met the proconsul and accomplished the business. Now, when I came back from Rome and was to make the report of our mission, my father left his seat and told me in private not to say I went, but we went, not I said, but we said, and in all other ways to associate my colleague in a joint report. For that sort of thing is not only honorable and kind, but it also takes the sting out of any envy of our reputation. This is a great example of the humble brag. On the surface, Plutarch presents himself as the diligent young man he is advising the essay's addressee, Menomachus, to become, listening to the advice of an older and wiser figure, his father. But here it is also clear that Plutarch had been on a prestigious assignment in some official capacity, even at a young age. We know nothing of why Plutarch's companion was not there, but we do know that Plutarch himself completed his assigned task and returned home a successful young man, one on whom people could depend. And from this passage, we are also assured that Plutarch is both a good student and a good son. This only works one way, with the actual performer elevating the non-performer. Plutarch shows us that when the non-performer tries to take over the action, it does not go so well, as we see from Crassus's fears about sharing his victory over Spartacus with Pompey and Pompey's relieving army, knowing that the palm of victory will go to the one bringing help. Okay, on to De Superstitione 170. Plutarch is denouncing atheism as well as superstition, and he thinks superstition is even worse. And he is working up a pretty good head of rhetorical steam. And here he says, as you see, why, for my part, I should prefer that men should say about me that I had never been born at all, and there is no Plutarch, rather than they should say, Plutarch is an inconstant, fickle person, quick-tempered, vindictive over little accidents, pained at trifles. If you invite others to dinner and leave him out, or if you haven't the time and don't go to call on him, or fail to speak to him when you see him, he will set his teeth into your body and bite it through. Or he will get hold of your little child and beat him to death. Or he will turn the bestidiones into your crops and spoil your harvest. This is not the Plutarch I'm used to. Plutarch uses the better never born argument elsewhere. As for instance, when he says it would have been better for Nicias never to have been born, he says it would have perhaps been the best thing in the world for Nicias to have got rid of his superstition in the same way as Midas and Aristodemus, rather than be affrighted at the shadow of the moon in eclipse. Should have just died. Russell exempts this passage from genuine disclosure, first-person statements. He believes it's commonplace in moralizing writing of all kinds. This is the passage I lament not having been able to talk with him, because I wonder, it's quite a litany of vivid examples of intense overreactions to minor slights. And in light of Plutarch's table talk and the very many parties he seems to have hosted or attended, I find it interesting that the litany of disaster begins with a slight about hosting dinner parties. Praise in the mouth of others is an acceptable, if transparent, literary device, deceptive, but used through many, many years. And it lets the author place praise or admiration for his own actions into the mouth of another in a way that's intolerable in a first-person account. I'm repeating that. In this passage, Plutarch put self-blame in the mouth of others. He used himself as a target of those vitriolic accusations and declared that non-existence was better than bad existence. He presents himself with embracing the blame with which he disagrees in a kind of litotic positivity, that taking on negativity is able in a way to be turned to positive. Now, I'm going to ask you to look yourself at the next passage in the interest of time and tell you what I think is going on here. You will see that Plutarch, shockingly, is telling the Athenians that they need to get over triumphs of the past, mind-bogglingly marathon the Eurymedon, Plataea. Leave this to the school of the sophists. That's his final sentence. Here, Plutarch rejects a sentimental presentation of Greece's past great leaders. He wants us to look into the mirror of his biographical subjects and emulate their behavior, but that emulation did not extend to contemporary politics in Plutarch's lifetime. Modern times for a Greek living during the Roman Empire evidently required different kinds of men from those who led Greece to victory against Persia or liberated Boeotia from Spartan occupation. Many of the great heroes of the past, men who would appear to be suitable role models and national heroes, Plutarch consigns to the uses of history, not appropriate for modern icons. His rejection of military victories as a meaningful barometer of character may be the reaction of Athenian living under Roman rule, who realizes that the military heyday of Athens is long over. If Athens wishes to judge herself or be judged on those terms, she will be found wanting. But there's more of interest in this passage. It is striking in its literary organization. The simile comes first, children dressing up. And I am laughing at some of my colleagues, Chandra and Michaela. I'm looking at you with little kids who surely have seen this phenomenon in your own household of your child suddenly appearing in either your clothes, perhaps your academic regalia, something that does not yet fit. So the simile comes first, the children dressing up, and the explanation later. The dynamic is superior, inferior, child, parent, masses, and city officials. And we laugh at the child dressing up. Part of the comedy lies in the fact that the child has failed, can't wear those shoes, and not necessarily aware that his actions are comic. So the Athenians, puffing themselves up over ancient battles, are the same as small children, putting on their father's shoes and then thinking themselves dressed and ready for action. This is not very flattering to the Athenians. And the fact that the adult clothes in which these folks are dressing up are great battles of the Persian Wars is most startling. It's almost impossible to believe that even by Plutarch's day, the Marathonamachoi were not officially revered, part of what the US calls now the greatest generation. But it was, after all, a battle in which the free Greeks, Athenian for the most part, had warded off a barbarian incursion, even if it were almost 500 years ago. So was Eurymedon, so was Plataea. Perhaps it was too dangerous to present those particular battles as examples of Athenian greatness. Elsewhere, Plutarch concludes that the Athenians were, in fact, greater in war than in peace. But in that essay, he compares them only against themselves. Perhaps these battles and the victories they secured were too personal, too painful to be experienced in front of others, as we recall Hegemon reciting his Gigantomachy parody to a highly amused crowd in Athens when the news of the Sicilian disaster arrived. His listeners not only refused to leave their seats, but laughed harder than ever, Athenaeus tells us. They were unwilling to present, I say, their true selves and emotions to others. We're encouraged to praise their self-control and awareness of their context, where they were. We're encouraged to praise that rather than blame what might have seemed like insouciance in the face of tragedy. So, in conclusion, I have tried to show that Plutarch was deeply engaged in the art of self-presentation, particularly when it came to the use of autoallelia or self-praise. In the passages we looked at, Plutarch presents himself to us as a good student and obedient son, a public-minded citizen, a deeply religious man, and a clear-eyed politician. It was important for his readers to have solid reasons for listening to and trusting him as he provided them with examples of how to live an ethical life. And one reason they did so was his skillful use of self-praise. We can see his skill in the essays and biographies. And in De Se Laudando, we have a roadmap for how we can ourselves use self-praise to improve our rhetorical impact without incurring disfavor and envy. Plutarch's advice is still useful today, and I, for one, hope that his attitude catches on. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Fran. That's all. Thank Fran. Sorry, I was just taking a note. Okay. With your permission, can I stop sharing the handout right now so that we can probably see more faces?
Yes. Yes, yeah. And thank you so much for doing that. I realize that's a
no problem at all. I'm very happy it worked. So I'm doing stop sharing now, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Okay, and I hope to see more faces rather than black spots, which always, disconcern me a bit, Okay. So I will still take that note in a sec, but If somebody in the meantime wants to ask a question, could you please wave the hand, or, you know, just unmute himself or herself if you want. We are, you know, in an intimate environment. Hello, Professor Snodinou, welcome.
A small question. I have an aporia.
Yes.
A small question.
Yeah.
First of all, I thank Professor Titchener for her excellent lecture. Ακούγομαι?
Yes, you can hear me just fine.
I was struck with this passage by Plutarch. His, let's say, treatment of Marathon and Salamis, actually. Well, I can understand that he's writing under Roman occupation, and he must be very careful. But on the other hand, you elaborated on this point. On the other hand, though, I think that he went too far. He doesn't say, let's say, that now is not the appropriate time to be proud of Marathon or Salamis. He says that it is a vain, a kenos, a vacuum, deceit, let's say, pride, which is worthy only of the sophists, let's say. I think that this is too much. And perhaps this shows something for Plutarch himself, for his relationship with the Romans and the Roman occupation. We should not forget that we are under Roman occupation, and we have this contradictory thing, let's say, Greek authors to talk about, let's say, Greece, freedom, everything, and on the other hand, we have this occupation. But I think Plutarch is, I don't know, I was really struck. That's my small aporia.
I was shocked when I first encountered this passage some years ago for exactly the reasons you said. And the other thing that if it had been more timely, in the beginning of the passage, the reference to the Roman boot, the Roman boot overhead is very explicit. It is one of the strongest things Plutarch says about the Romans, and it seems quite bold. To the extent we don't know how Plutarch interacted with elite Romans. We know he addresses essays to them and talk about them, but we really only have one side. In terms of going too far to consign these things to sophists, one thing that occurs to me, Professora, and perhaps tell me what you think about this. When we hear consigned to the sophists, I think we all have this kind of reaction of, ooh, you know, you are saying that this is no application to reality, that this is a sort of intellectual fantasy, that this, or something other. Is there perhaps a subtlety here? Does Plutarch include himself somehow as one of the people that's keeping that tradition? And that perhaps one of the things he says is, Marathon is terrible. You are right. None of you people talk about it anymore. I will talk about it. And people like me. What do you think? Is this possible when he says, leave it to the sophists? That maybe to the Greek hearers, this is, that's not such a bad thing, that that's a tradition to keep it going. That might let Plutarch off the hook a little bit, because otherwise, I agree, of all things, attacking Marathon. And so what do you think? Is there any possibility that there's a subtlety there? Plutarch, I don't think, would call himself a sophist. Again, I'm not a philosopher, so I defer to pretty much everybody else everybody else here, but I'm curious, do you think that's possible?
I don't know.
No, I agree. It's a difficult problem. If you are asking me in terms of Fran agrees with Katarina that was going a little too far. Dr. Titchener feels that there may be more rhetorical juice in that lemon. How is that? Now I attempt to have my cake. I attempt to have things both ways.
I don't know. It's a problem.
It is.
Yeah, that's the good part of it. Yeah. So, Professor Ewan Bowie, please.
Hello. Thank you very much, Fran. And I will stick with.
Oh.
Δεν ακούμε.
Yeah. There is
Yeah.
some minor problem, but let's not panic.
No, this is business as usual in my world.
Yeah.
We just try to figure out.
Just.
Lucia is going to help. I can see that.
Yeah. Our connection is okay for the time being, so probably Ewan is having some problem. I think it's frozen irreversibly for the time being.
Right.
So
that is all right. Let me ask the Plutarchans in the audience. How did I do representing his viewpoint? His oeuvre is so enormous, to draw conclusions and generalizations is difficult. What do you think? Was I slanting too much from my own perspective, or did I give a balanced reading? I'm looking for self-praise. I'm injecting self-praise into the
okay, but I'm
others.
jumping in as the organizer. I'm saying the most honest thing. By the way, I'm not an expert in Plutarch by any means. I'm a tragedy person. So, and I've been meaning to ask you some questions, by the way, when everything else is over, which have to do more with my ignorance, of course. But I guess, you know, we have people in the audience who definitely have worked on Plutarch, certainly more than I did, which means never.
More than I.
No, not for you. For me, of course, never. So, yeah. Would I'm seeing you in strong. Does anyone else want to ask a question or make a comment before we can restore the contact with Ewan Bowie?
I see Ewan is muted though.
Okay. I don't see him at all, basically, but okay.
Being muted.
Ewan, hey.
Am I now audible and visible?
We can hear you right now. Yes.
I got cut off for some local reason.
Okay.
I wanted to say that in this very interesting passage that Fran looked at and Katerina was talking about, I think it is important to remember that he is here talking about what is right or wrong to say in the context of local political speeches in cities. And it's interesting that the lower translation, which you used, calls hoi archontes officials, which really gets a very wrong note in my view. These are people who are the local bosses and they have responsibilities to their city, and negotiation with the imperial power is very important. It doesn't exclude somebody like Plutarch and other people writing about Marathon and Salamis, writing biographies of Themistocles and so on. And of course, in the particular case of the Persian Wars, it's clear that everybody in the decades of late first, early second century was building up a wave of enthusiasm about the Persian War resistance by the Greeks, encouraged indeed by Rome, as I think Tony Spalforth has very well shown in his 2012 book. What is at the same time very interesting, I think, is how the picture that you very convincingly gave us of Plutarch's great discretion in self-presentation is at one end of the spectrum of all we know about people in these 2 centuries, or almost all the people we know. Pliny seemed to go too far, but by comparison with people who are actually sophists, contemporaries of Plutarch like Nicetes and Scopelianus, and in the next generation, Polemo and Herodes, who may have overlapped with Plutarch a little bit, Pliny is a saint. And Plutarch, in his philosophical ambience created in Chaironeia, has around him in every city in Greece, and maybe in Chaironeia too, people who are much more self-pretentious, much more pretentious and self-praising. So I think the sophists there is a little dig at one of the major cultural streams of his generation, and it doesn't have to be an entirely logical dig. But I've not really got a question here, but I'm expressing my response to your extremely exciting paper. Thank you, Fran.
Well, and thank you for that, Ewan. One of the blessings and curses for, as you all know, is with Plutarch, one is always running into another enormous discipline that, in my case, that is unmastered. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a rhetorician. And I'm trying to expand my understanding of Plutarch and his different works, but I quickly run into places where it's the unexplored frontier for me. So that's kind of a waffly way of saying I'm not particularly equipped, I don't think, to comment on the sophistic tradition, but I like the idea that, now do I understand you, that it's kind of like a local shout out when he says to the sophists that everybody listening to this has a shared understanding of what that means, that's not necessarily pejorative.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Professor Athanasakis, would you like to ask a question? Professor Athanasakis is just the...
I think it is Michele Lucchesi who wanted to ask.
Okay, Michele, sorry. Hi, we are finally able to make contact.
Nice to speak.
Hi, thank you very much for joining, and I'm very glad to see you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Fran, for for your really amazing paper and very, very thought-provoking. And I have a question actually, in the sense that do we perhaps get different images of Plutarch throughout his body of work? In the sense, do we have let's say Plutarch, the politician, different from Plutarch, the philosopher, or I don't know, maybe Plutarch, the symposiast? And if that is so, do we have different ways in which he can present himself in different situations, and different ways in which he praises himself or tries to avoid too great of self-praise, depending on the different situations in which he portrays himself? I don't know. I suspect that there might be differences, but I'm very much interested in what you think. And thank you again.
Well, and thank you, especially for this question. because this is a real hot one. I'm going to quote my dear friend Luke Vanderstock, who has started, well, he says quite firmly, there is only one Plutarch. That's one side. Other side is exactly what you were just saying, which is that there is multifaceted Plutarch, and that he can be in a rhetorical mode, he can be in a philosophical mode, and with things like the Consolationes, he even brings a different kind of literary strategies to bear. And so Plutarchian scholars are pretty actively divided on this. And since you asked me what I think, I'm going to tell you what I think, but I cannot recognize, I'm not representing a united scholarly opinion here. I think there are multiple Plutarchs. And I think that just as we were looking at the roles he presents himself in, he talks about himself as a young man when he's obsessed with mathematics. And then he makes a joke about, well, then once he got involved with Delphi and, made an agon, he had to give up being obsessed. So just the mere fact that he's describing himself at all these different stages of his life would suggest to me that we're looking at different Plutarchs. Plutarch that was, Plutarch that is talking about Plutarch that was, even with the Anseni passage, Plutarch's intentions to continue being a public servant and all. And so I do think there are many versions of Plutarch, and I think he gives us different versions depending on what he wants. And I say this partly from decades of experience as a teacher. There are students, and every single person listening to me knows this and has done this. There are students that you let talk or cry until they're done, and then you say, you can do this, I will help you. There are other students that you stop and say, you need to listen to me. I see we are all, for everybody smiling about that part. So the point is, this is still me. And yet, if student A said, I went to see Dr. T, she was so helpful and kind and all this, the other person says, you have got to be kidding. She listened to what she actually said to me. She told me to come back when I had done some actual research, that asking her for references was not doing research. Now I am living my own past. So Michaela, at the risk of how I wish I could argue with him right here, with Luke Vanderstock, at the risk of disagreeing with such a distinguished figure whom I admire, I think there are many kinds of Plutarch and Plutarch presentations. And just the way we wear a tuxedo for a formal occasion and beach clothes at the beach, Plutarch is very adept at which Plutarch he wants to use. But I defer to a whole lot of other people who could probably argue me against that. So I will commit to you, Michaela, I commit to the multi-Plutarch.
Multi-layered Plutarch, yeah. Okay. Professor Athanasaki?
Well, thank you. Thank you for a great talk, Fran. I think that you convinced me, especially Plutarch, in all stages of his life. I think that's a beautiful way of presenting the topic. I don't have a question. I have simply a remark. And the remark is that it is so different. I'm sorry, I have to open the door. Can I come back in 1 minute?
Sure.
Whatever, of course. We're not in any rush. Come back whenever you want. Meanwhile, can I jump with a very, level-headed question, Fran, please? You said at the beginning about Plutarch defining self-praise as shameless, right? In his shameless. Could you please tell me the Greek word? Is that the Greek term anyway, or the shameless stuff anyway?
Let's see. I'm looking at the beginning of this. Is Dondo, I think.
As I said, I don't know anything about Plutarch, and I don't pretend to know anything about Plutarch, so this is why I'm asking only. So if the shamelessness is defined in terms of,
I'm looking for the precise word.
yeah, well, okay.
It's epokhthes,
Okay.
but that's offensive.
Okay. Okay.
And so that's not right. That's not the right word. I'm not sure I can find it. I'm so sorry. Right on the spot.
Never mind.
I will send it to you. I don't think it's.
Yes, sure. Yes, take your time. Meanwhile, yes, Professor Athanasaki, please. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry for that, but it is one of these things that is bound to happen.
Yeah.
I was thinking, Fran, how different Plutarch is from Pindar, because when you look at Pindar, there is no moderation. There is not anything, oh, when you are a young man, you know, you should do this and that. I mean, I'm thinking of Pindar to Hieron, where he says, may I always be the best poet in Greece, and may you always be, you know, the best king among all kings. So it seems to me that something must have happened around Horace's time, although Horace is not as modest as Plutarch seems to be, at least, you know, in when he was younger. So something must have happened in self-presentation. I am ashamed to say that I haven't followed all seminars because I couldn't. But something, I don't know, is it Christianity? What is it? But it seems to me that there is something separating the world of Pindar from.
No, I had in my notes at some point was thinking that the Epinician poetry talk about praise in the mouth of others, that you commission a poem about yourself and your greatness and have it recited before yourself and all, but you have offloaded some envy because it's other people talking about you. It's not you doing it yourself. And as I was giving the paper, I was thinking about this, which is bad. Talking and thinking at the same time is bad. But I wondered if this were part of a way of thinking, perhaps, that by the time we get to Plutarch, there's all kinds of appropriate ways to have yourself praised as long as you're not doing these offensive things. I wonder about Christianity, because at that point, people are other directed. The praise becomes a very particular thing, especially divine praise or to praise God. And that's just a whole completely different territory, and that we can't if we praise God, praising ourselves that's elevating ourselves as where we should be. And so I don't know, but I certainly agree with you that things seem to have changed. I think I put too much stock myself in how different the world was for Greeks under Roman occupation. As many of you know, I spent time in Crete with Professor Athanasaki and Professor Bowie, and I hope it's not inappropriate for me to say that because of the kindness of people taking me to different memorials and telling me about the history of Greece, getting to meet Gabrielle and Hugh, descendants of Stanley Moss and such, my understanding of Greek resistance and living under occupation completely changed. In that I on the spot ceased to see Plutarch as content with the situation, or somehow that it didn't really matter because other things were good. So, you know, what have the Romans done for us lately? It just evaporated. And I thought, and that's why I'm interested in the vitriol in that last passage I gave you, in terms of, is part of his thought, this doesn't matter because it's all over, we're all under the Roman boot. This is a different world. And so that tends to color my thinking in terms of what changed, but Christianity and the spread of Christianity is also part of that. And so I don't know, but I agree with you that there is a different feeling.
Professor Sakopoulou, please. Silvano, your mic. Silvana.
Thank you.
Ella, hi.
Thank you very much indeed for your talk. This is a follow-up to what Lucia suggested. I think that the influence of the Stoics is very prominent. And that this is what explains this attitude, which is completely different from Pindar's attitude. And we may find in the Stoic texts the outline of this attitude, not only in the Latha Viosas, but also when it comes to poetry, when it comes to praising one's own skills. It is, and it does have to do with the Roman occupation and with the stance one takes towards it. I don't know how much Plutarch has interiorized it, and this is my question.
To what extent Plutarch has internalized the Roman occupation attitude?
And the Stoic.
And the Stoic.
Yes.
Now I'm in philosophical territory again over my head. Plutarch's a Platonist, and so he is foundational. I'm going to get my foot in my mouth. Second sophistic studies involving Plutarch and others. I'm not sure I would be able to explain the Stoic influence in there, and I apologize for my deficiencies here. I'm not sure I can answer the question. Can any of you philosophical people out there help me?
Well,
because I think it is a very interesting question.
I think the Plutarch was against the Stoics. But
yes.
it doesn't mean anything, of course.
Well,
he could be against the Stoics, but nonetheless, he could be influenced by the teachings of the Stoics.
Yes, but the Stoics themselves thought that they were Platonists in one sense, that they systematized Platonic views. So
in a way,
I'm only referring to this side to this aspect of Plutarch, which is this modest side of his, which is in accordance to the Stoics more than to the Christians, because even the Christians got it from the Stoics.
This requires a new study.
He talks about things like in his essay De Cogitenda Ira. He speaks favorably about some attitudes I believe are Stoic, in terms of if you control your expectations, you will not be angry. You know, unmet expectations or unreasonable expectations can lead to anger. But he does attack the Stoics in some of the Moralia pretty intensely. What I don't know is whether that means he completely disagrees with them, because Plutarch is, I think, things like the Malice of Herodotus, where he just really goes nuts. And yet people think there's a lot of rhetoric in there. He doesn't actually slam or hate Herodotus as much as he says. So again, I am at a disadvantage here.
Not at all. Thank you.
Professor Bowie, would you like to ask a question, or is
yes, please. Yes. Am I audible? Yes. I just wanted to follow up on the Stoics and agree with what Fran was saying, that he is very critical of many aspects of Stoic doctrine at various points in the Moralia. He's critical of some he's a bit humorous at the expense of some Stoic individuals and the Quaestiones Convivales. So his philosophical friends are academics, Platonist Stoic academics along a spectrum. At one end, I suppose, Favorinus, though he's not entirely happy with Favorinus either. But I find it difficult to see the position he's taking up in these passages through which Fran has taken us as the result of any particular Stoic commitment. It stands very near to where Horace stands, as Stephen's talk was exploring, and Horace too has not very much time for Stoics. He's an Epicurean, if anything. So I'm not sure about Stoicism as an important influence, Silvana. Sorry about that. And I'm not a philosopher, but that's where I would go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any other little yellow hands, which I'm seeing in my nightmares. I'm not seeing any hands, so that means the ground is clear. Frank, can I please ask you, I must be totally honest, I was not paying very much attention to this point because I was trying to sort something technical out about the distinction between luck and merit.
Mm-hmm.
That you made.
Yes, that what Plutarch was saying is
could
that.
You please elaborate or just repeat that? Very,
okay,
very briefly, if you could please. Because
this is ascribing success to luck is one way of diverting envy over self-praise.
Okay.
And Plutarch says that's because if we are beaten by luck, then that's not our fault. But if we are beaten by merit, that's on us all the way. So if I, for instance, if I'm terrible at trying to do examples at the last moment. If I win a race, I'm trying to beat somebody somewhere in my car and we each go a different route and their route is obstructed by a sudden power failure and there's no traffic light and I get ahead. The person that loses does not feel like they're an inferior driver to me. Bad luck hurt them. Whereas if this person failed to succeed by being unable to operate the vehicle or not knowing what to do or getting distracted or just, then you'd say, well, that was my fault. So if it's your skill that's lacking, then that's your fault. If I have a contest with Lucia and we're going to declaim Pindar and I don't prepare, I don't memorize, I don't do anything and I just turn up and come. And Lucia does a beautiful thing, that's on me. That's my failure. On the other hand, if my internet feed goes out, that is bad luck and that's not my fault. So I don't feel bad. I mean, I do. I don't feel bad about the internet failure the way I do about a public personal failure. And so that's why Plutarch is saying that as long as if somebody says to me, Fran, you just did the best job. And I say, I was so lucky. This person was there to help me. And I was able to contact so-and-so. And all these people helped me. I was so lucky. Then that's kind of good. Whereas if you said it's great paper, say, yeah, I thought so too. The last one I gave was pretty good, but this was a lot better. And so it was like, oh.
It's pretty clear, pretty clear. Thank you very much. Thank you for this. So, any other questions or comments? If not, let us thank Fran again once more. We do, yes, of course, we should do that. Yes.
I thank you all so much. Yeah. As I said, I've been way out of practice. It's been a long time. This is very nice.
We all been out of practice. We all been, believe me. But we do hope, and I do promise that we will, we'll meet in Athens. Okay.
We will indeed. We will indeed. Thank you all so much for coming and listening and interacting and giving me good ideas. It means a great deal.
Thank you.